Let's begin in prayer. Bow with me. Thank you, God, for your love and for your protection and for your providence and for the ways that you have always cared for us as your people. Lord, we see that in the stories we're going to look at today, that you do provide, but that we as your people need to be thankful. We need to be always aware of the things that you're doing in our lives and the ways that you're taking care of us, at least the ways that we can, and be grateful to you. You have done amazing and awesome things, and help us, Lord, to always be looking for those ways in which we can give you praise and give you honor and focus on the good that you're doing in our lives. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are going to cover an entire series of stories today from Exodus chapter 15 through 18. There's a bunch of little episodes here in quick succession, and they have a pretty common theme. So I want to start with the theme and make sure that we've got kind of in our mind the direction that things seem to be going in the story, and then we can go from there and talk about some of the details of the story. So if we're kind of building the story, we've got in chapter 15, the crossing of the Red Sea, right? Or chapter 14, the crossing of the Red Sea. Chapter 15 is the song of praise that is offered in thanksgiving for what God has done in bringing them out of Egypt and getting them across the Red Sea and destroying the Egyptian army and doing all the things that God has done, amazing things that God has done up until this point of the story. But at the end of chapter 15, we have a story, and all of these stories are going to kind of have some common threads. So I just want to mention kind of a brief title for each of the different stories, and then we'll talk about some of the overarching themes. So we've got them needing water and God providing the water, right? At the end of chapter 15, the making the water sweet. Then we have in chapter 16, you can see all this in your subheadings, you've got the manna that is provided, and you've got quail that is provided because the people need food. And then in chapter 17, you've got the first episode of water coming from a rock. And so God provides water again in a miraculous way. Then at the end of chapter 17, you have their first real battle that they're going to face, where they actually have to do some of the fighting. It's not just God, crashing the waters back down on the army and eliminating it for them. So they're having to fight, and God, of course, provides them victory in a very obvious, it's very obvious who's winning the battle, not the people. And then chapter 18, we've got the story of Jethro. So that kind of takes a little bit of a different turn, but there is a sense in which there still is this thread still carries through in chapter 18. So understand, I know we're familiar with the stories. I think probably all of us in here have either grown up with these stories or have studied them multiple times in our lives as we've gone through these 3-year cycles here or in other studies that you've done. We're familiar with these stories of God providing water or sweetening the water, providing manna, providing quail, providing water from a rock, providing victory. What are the common themes? There's more than one, but I'm interested to see what you come up with. God will provide. Okay, so we got that one, since I kind of sounded like a broken record there for a moment. But yes, you've got God providing, right? Here they are. Just kind of put yourself in the scenario. They have been rescued, brought to the other side of the Red Sea, and now they got to figure out where to go from here. I mean, kind of. Because we also know God is providing what? Direction. How? Okay, how's he leading them? Okay, you got the pillar of cloud, so you've got a very visual representation of what God wants you to do. Man, sometimes I wish we had a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, don't you? But just that idea of a very clear, all right, the cloud's moving, guys, pack up, let's go. It's very you got to wonder how slow that cloud moved too, right? I mean, moving 1 million people and all the animals and packing everything up and getting ready to go, that had to be pretty extensive amount of work there. So and then a pillar of fire by night, right? And I would assume it's a large enough pillar of fire that you can see it all over the campground. Which again, you can imagine how large of a campsite that's going to be for 1 million people plus all their belongings and animals. So again, pretty remarkable provision there that we already know about. So we've got God providing direction, he's providing food, he's providing hydration. Because again, where are they at? The Midian, which is what kind of climate? Yeah, not, I mean, this, as far as I'm aware, this isn't the most fertile section of the earth. I don't know that it is necessarily unfertile. This isn't Sahara Desert, but it is, I mean, it definitely is not a land that is going to provide food easily for 1 million plus people plus animals. Right? I mean, that's a lot. So you've got all of that going on, okay? So God provides, right? What other threads? Do what? Say it again. This generation of Israelites are fantastic at grumbling. Yeah, you got a very common theme of grumbling that goes through the whole thing, okay? And again, that's one of those threads that even goes into chapter 18, because chapter 18 is about Moses acting as judge. What is he judging over? Their complaints, right? Like their disputes. They're angry at their neighbor. Their tent is too close to my tent. They touched me. That kind of. He's dealing with all of the complaints, and so again, you got this complaining people. We don't have water. We don't have food. We're tired of this food. We don't have water again. That kind of reaction from a lot of people, right? So you've got the complaining thread. We're going to do some application near the end of class. And what else?
They seem to have forgotten they were in slavery.
Okay, yeah, there's a thread of entitlement that goes through this. I don't know. I love that you pick up on that. Like that is an interesting piece to me. Here you've got a people who have for generations been slaves. They've had nothing going for them. God comes in and rescues them, and doesn't just rescue them in a, hey, let's sneak out in the darkness of night kind of way, but rescues them in a miraculous and amazing way. And what you would think is that would produce a certain amount of gratitude, appreciation, and submission to God. Wouldn't you? But it doesn't. It produces a sense of entitlement of, well, I don't know if it's we're better than everybody else because our God is bigger and stronger, therefore we deserve more. I'm not sure where that comes from. But there is most definitely this sense of entitlement that leads to the complaining that you see kind of go through the stories. What else? So when God provides, how does he provide? In pretty mundane, simple ways? Yes, both of those. Miraculously and abundantly. So God doesn't just, okay, well, just trying to think of a pretty mundane way to provide water out in the wilderness where they're at. But, God doesn't just lead them up on the next stream. Okay? The stream he brings them to is nasty, like undrinkable. Which, again, why do that? Could God have led them to a good stream? You think? Or could God have led them to a well that was already dug, and now they're able to get their own water out of the ground? Yeah, Yeah, I mean, he could have already fixed the water before they got there. Why is it that God leads them to a stream that would have given them, honestly, a frustrating and false hope? Right? You've seen the movies where somebody's crawling across the desert and they see the water in the distance and, and then all of a sudden they get their life back, in them because they're going to get to the water, and then it's a mirage and they're drinking sand kind of thing. It's kind of a trope of those kind of movies. Here, you almost have that picture here in the story, do you not? Of, yes, finally we have water, and then it's undrinkable water. And just, that would have, the being thirsty in the first place would have been bad enough, but having water you can't drink, doesn't that make it worse? Right? I mean, that is remarkable to me. And then God, through leading Moses, fixes the water for the people and everybody is able to have their drink. I mean, it teaches that miraculous, hey, you're dependent on me lesson. Right? And I think that's an important piece of this.
And enough water for 1 million people and all that.
Yeah. And that goes back to the second comment of abundance. God doesn't just provide water, but everybody has just enough to wet their tongue. No, I mean, it is enough for 1 million plus people and all of the animals and everybody. And probably, again, the benefit of a river as opposed to a well is, could you imagine how long it would have taken to get all the water out of the well to service that many people and animals? But here they can all lead all their animals down to the water. Again, I don't know how large the stream was, but it was enough that it was able to take care of all those people. So again, it's interesting to see that. Manna, same way. There's always enough manna for everybody to get their belly full. Always. And the way that the manna works, well, somebody describe that to me. I know we're getting into some details here, but somebody describe, how does the manna work?
Comes every day.
Okay. Except Saturday, yep.
Gather it, they can look at what they eat that day. Try to get it.
Yep. Okay, anything left over rots, except for Friday, because you can gather enough for 2 days, and for whatever reason that day it doesn't rot or get worms in it, is typically the way it works. So, I mean, here you've got, what's interesting is it's almost like God's hand is on every gathering bowl, right? I mean, can you prevent the worms from showing up? Can you put saran wrap on top, make sure the worms don't get in there? No, except on Friday, right? For whatever reason, on Friday, it's a special type of manna that lasts for 2 days instead of 1 day. I mean, it just, there's a constant reminder there, is there not? And that's what I find, that's the other theme or thread that I think is important to weave through all of these stories, is that it's not just that these provisions are miraculous and that they are abundant, but they are a daily and honestly multiple times a day reminder of who is leading them, who is taking care of them, and who is providing for them. They get reminded of it all day long, every single day. Like, you take manna. What was manna? Loaves of bread that fell out of heaven? Anybody remember how it's described in Scripture? So, like, do what? Appears on the ground. What'd you say? Tastes like wafers and honey. Okay. It described like coriander seed at one point. I mean, it was, honestly, it seemed that it's not like it was little like fish food flakes that you stick in your mouth. Like it's almost like it was the product you needed to turn it into. It was like having flour fall from heaven, but not flour. But it was like barley seed or something, where you could take it and turn it into something. And that's the way that, like, it wasn't just you walked out there and you're able to stick food in your mouth straight off the ground. It was you were able to gather your supplies and be able to go make something with it. That entire process is a reminder that God provided this. So you've got that reminder, you've got the cloud and the fire that is a constant reminder, you've got the water that you're drinking that is a reminder. I mean, just all through the entire story, you've got this, remember who is the one providing and taking care of you. Is that not important? Especially considering what we talked about, I think on Wednesday, either Wednesday or last Sunday, this idea of God is introducing himself. Okay? It's been interesting to well, I don't want to embarrass any of my children, so I won't use that as an example. Let me use, man, now I don't know how to do this without embarrassing one of my children. I'll just move on. So it's always been interesting to me to watch the way people interact. And that there's, I'll use myself as an example. So I remember back in the FC days when I was dating much, and the FC had a thing called Happy Mail. And we had a mail system there, and you could make little notes and write them to people and all of that kind of stuff. And it was, this was before texting. So you didn't really have that, it's not like we could text all day long. If you wanted to talk to somebody, you actually had to call them on the phone. We weren't payphone days. Like there were those days. We were after the payphone days. Were you payphone days? Yeah. Where you had to go to the payphone in the hallway, and that just seems embarrassing. We actually had phones that we could call on in our individual rooms, but it was, you still had to make time for each other to do that. So the way you would have little reminders of each other through the day would be through Happy Mail or something like that. You'd find other ways of interacting. Now you just send text all day long, right? And it's a constant reminder of somebody lives in your back pocket. I mean, that's kind of the way it worked now. But we tend to do that when we're building relationships, right? We're constantly in contact with each other because that's how you grow closer, right? And that's kind of the way God is treating the Israelites here. He is in constant contact with them, giving them constant reminders that he is there, that he is helping, that he is providing, that he is protecting, that he is doing all the things he has promised and that he will promise that he is going to do for them as their God. And I love that here in these stories, as miraculous as they are, they're really God revealing himself as a God who is courting them until they belong to him. That's how I see these stories. And I just find that amazing that God would do the things the way he did them because it made that possible. Keith?
You said a word earlier that I think describes that really well. Right? Not only is God using himself to people, he's teaching them, by extension, all of mankind, the dependence that we should have. You see this in Deuteronomy 4 later when Moses tells the people, remember these things I've taught you. The nation will see how great these statutes are, and they will learn to love God because of that. Israel was a model. And so everything that we see through these early days with Jehovah introducing himself to people and constantly providing, constantly reinforcing this message of depend on me, depend on me, is a model, is an extension for all of it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, I know speaking for myself, I really struggle with that.
Yeah.
Because there are so many things, that we're taught culturally to depend on ourselves and personal possibility, which those are absolutely, there's a place for that. But from this, beginning times when it comes to the pages of Exodus, we see God being just beautiful with this message.
Yeah. Well, and I even love the whole idea of, you mentioned Deuteronomy 4. If you skip over Deuteronomy 6, you've got that well-known passage of, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, you shall love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. But you read right after that, and it basically says, these are the things you will teach your children, Repeat them to your children. Verse 7, talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. So when are you supposed to talk about the Lord and the things he's done? All the time. You're to constantly remind your children and think yourself about all the things the Lord has done for you. We don't do that well. I mean, again, I don't do that well. I can't say you don't do that well. But, I mean, I most definitely spend time with God. But I don't know that I think about God the way that's described, or the way you see it being presented here in these miracles that we have in this part of Exodus. Again, thinking back to my FC dating my wife days, I thought about her all day long. I mean, that's where my brain turned to whenever it wasn't intentionally occupied on something at the moment. Like, in class, my brain wanders. I'm thinking about, where are we going to do this evening? Where are we going to go? Are we going to go on a date this weekend? Like, that's where your brain defaults to, because that becomes the relationship that is most important, right? Should our brains not do that with God? And that seems to be the presentation God's making to the people here of, I will be a constant presence. I will be the pillar of cloud. I will be the pillar of fire. I will be the one who provides. I will be the one who gives you your sustenance every single day. I will constantly be there. And he weaves that through these miracles. Again, he could have done all of these things in a different way. He could have miraculously dropped a map, a scroll of a map from heaven into right in front of Moses, and Moses had it, and they had it in their little leader's tent where they can roll it out and see what's the next step that they're going to take. But instead of doing that, God provides direction in a way that is visible to every Israelite. That's on purpose. Okay? God could have found other ways to provide food or provide water or provide all these things, but God doesn't. And again, I think pointing, kind of proving the case is the battle with the Amalekites at the end of chapter 17, right? When you look over there with me, chapter 17, Amalek comes to fight. This is verse 9. Moses says to Joshua, select some men, go fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand. So Joshua does it. They fight against Amalek. And while Moses, verse 11, held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he put his hand down, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew weary, they took a stone and put it under him. He sat down on it, and Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until the sun went down. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. The Lord then said to Moses, write this down on a scroll as a reminder and recite it to Joshua. I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. Then Moses built an altar and named it, The Lord is my banner. He said, indeed, my hand is lifted up toward the Lord's throne. The Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. But just this idea of can you imagine how powerful that was to hear the story of how God was the one who prevailed? And it's not just Moses who knows it. Who else knows it? Everybody around Moses knows what's going on. Now, I imagine Joshua didn't necessarily, like Joshua's not like looking at the enemy, looking at Moses, hands up, let's go. Like I'm sure that's not the issue. But, here, do you think Joshua was told? Yeah. I mean, Moses was directly told, give this message to Joshua, that God's going to win this battle, that God's going to blot out the name of Amalek from the face of the earth. Like that, to me, that is, that's amazing to see that even in winning this battle, it becomes obvious that, yeah, they're going to put forth their effort, just like they're going to gather up the manna and make something with it, just like they have to gather up their water when God provides it, and they have to go out and pick up the quail whenever God brought it in. And, they still have to do their work to experience the blessings of God. But it doesn't change the fact that it is so obvious that it is a blessing from God. And I think that becomes an important part of this whole story. Okay, so again, since we kind of hit most of the high points of the story, anything, let's just kind of go story by story. Any other thoughts on the first time God, this general first? Okay, yeah.
I'm just trying to think of what would the proper response for these people be? Instead of complaining to Moses, because they're not familiar with God or how to address God or anything, what would it have looked like to, what would be the proper response, I guess?
I don't know that there is one at this point. So I don't want to come down too harshly on the Israelites at this point of the story. Now, later on, when God's getting angry at them, that already 10 times the Israelites have complained about his provisions and all of that. At some point, they've got to realize, okay, God's trustworthy. We've seen his power. We've seen his provision. We've seen his protection. We've seen him win battles for us. We've seen him do all the things God. Now it's time for us to sit back and be quiet and let him be God. I think there's a point at which that should be the expectation. I don't know that that's the point yet, because like you said, they're still getting to know what God is doing for them and what God is taking care of, which is why I think at this point, God gets a little frustrated with the quail at the moment of providing, they're complaining about manna. God is providing food for them. There's a big difference between we might starve to death and we don't like this food. That to me, those are two different. If my children were hungry at home, that'd be one thing. When they're complaining that the food doesn't taste just right, that's a different story. And so I know that doesn't answer your question at all, because I don't know what the proper response or what the proper avenue for that complaint is. Because, again, like you said, they don't really have access to God. Moses is their access to God. They don't have a tabernacle yet. They don't have all of that established. I'm trying not to come down too harshly on the Israelites at this point in the story. Okay, Keith? Yeah.
He never says, well, how many men? What, can we win this fight? Or anything.
Yeah.
And, Moses, Aaron, both, but they always question Joshua. He never questioned.
So my favorite thing about Joshua is, at least as long as Moses is with him, Joshua never misses a beat, ever. Now, I do think there's some questionable moments when you get into the book of Joshua, which we'll talk about when we get there. But at this point, his trust in God because of Moses is remarkable. And I think you're right. Like every single time you read of Joshua, all the way through Deuteronomy, he is 100% on board whatever Moses says and with whatever God says. And I think that's one of the reasons he is chosen to be essentially Moses' right-hand man. Even from this early in the story, Joshua is an impressive person. Matt? Mm-hmm.
So there's always a reminder of being tested constantly on that. Do I have faith? Am I going to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. Keith?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the response. I agree that there isn't one feels like there's actually more faith in their responses to God that they played the Israelites.
Yeah.
Their leading Pharaoh says, "Oh, we tell your God to bless you." Right? I wonder if the Israelites had gone up and said, we know we come to you and ask you for God.
Maybe so. I also think there is a sense in which there is a cultural hang-up. You've got to remember that the way that the ancient peoples understood their gods is that their gods were geographical and they were specific in what they could do for humanity. So this was the god of the harvest. This was the god of fertility. This was the god of storms and rain. And so they had very specific functions. And what God is doing is revealing himself as the God who fills all functions and who is in all places. That is a very different understanding of deity. That I try to give the Israelites as much slack as I can on some of that, because that's not what they've ever been used to before. And this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how they know him. He is the God who said, according to their history, "I will go down to Egypt with you." Remember, that's what he told Jacob. And he will return to the promised land with them. I mean, there is a sense in which even God early on presents himself in the same sort of ways that they would have understood deity. But he is revealing to them, no, realize I'm more than that. Let me reveal this to you step by step. You are a God who, or I am a God who is able to provide all of your blessings, and I am a God who is able to provide all of your protection and be with you anywhere you go, because I am in every place. That is a very different perception. So again, I'm going to give them a little slack. That being said, none of that applies to us. We have no excuse for not trusting in God. And so there's a lesson in that for us too. So Ron?
Just to add to what you were saying, with the ancient version of the pagan gods, they worked on them as entities to be appeased.
Yep.
Primarily.
Yep.
And here we have true God putting himself out there with the care, the promise, and he is presenting himself as the creator who wants to have a relationship with him. Totally new.
Yeah.
Different from anything that mankind had done.
So let me also throw the Israelites under the bus for a moment, because what you said just reminded me of this. Because you're absolutely right. The ancient gods were gods who needed to be appeased. Your job was to keep them happy, or they were going to come down and be wrathful. Is the complaining about what God is not doing going to keep God happy? No. So there is a sense in which it is a little bit odd that they are as open with their complaint as they are. And again, I don't know if that's because they were, or that's just the way that's the way we tend to interpret what's written down here about the way that they do complain about, because who do they complain to? Moses. And ultimately, I don't know that in that they're complaining, honestly, their complaints here are about Moses, what Moses has done and the situation Moses has put them in. And so even there, the people grumbled, chapter 15, verse 24, the people grumbled to Moses. So he cries out to the Lord. When you get into the next chapter, again, they're complaining to Moses. It's interesting, down in verse 8, Moses continued, "The Lord will give you meat in the morning, meat to eat this evening, and all the bread you want in the morning, for he has heard the complaints that you are rising against him. Who are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord." And it seems that Moses is, they're complaining that Moses and Aaron and Miriam aren't leading them and providing for them. And Moses is trying to remind them, we weren't providing for you in the first place. Like, we didn't make the bread show up. That was the Lord. So you're complaining against him. Why do you think he says it that way? If you're a people who have been brought up to keep the gods happy, yeah, what Moses is saying is, hey, this is not going to work out well for you. If you're complaining against the God or against the God and treating him like the gods, then you're going to get yourself in trouble. And so again, I think that Ron's absolutely right in that, the common understanding was keep the gods happy or they're going to be wrathful, they're going to come down against us, they're going to be angry at us, which is how the Egyptians understood Israel's God, right? That's why let's give you all of our gold and possessions because we want your God to be happy with us. That same sort of idea. Here, these people aren't realizing that their complaint is against the Lord. They're seeing it as complaints against Moses. And so that becomes a big piece of this. So here, yep, Keith.
So I noticed progression. Moses also watered the Meribah. God tells him to strike the water with the rod. Then, and I can't find any signs of stuff like this. In the Battle of Ammon, the Amalekites, Moses just said, I'm going to hold up my rod. God didn't tell him. He just decided to do this on his own. And it's things that we have to progress in faith as well ourselves. Progress also. If God may not tell you directly, we can let God that He will provide.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, there's that rod becomes an interesting piece in this whole story. So that's an interesting study in and of itself, just to follow the rod, see what all happens with the stick. All right, so we don't necessarily have time for that. So we've, again, I feel like we've at least talked about each of these stories and seen the way that they are used together. I want to spend a few minutes on chapter 18. So Exodus chapter 18, you've got the story of Jethro and Moses and these pieces. Jethro, verse 2, Moses' father-in-law, had taken in Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he sent her back, along with her two sons, one of whom was named Gershom, and the other Eleazar. Because he said, the God of my fathers was my helper and rescued me from Pharaoh's sword. Moses' father-in-law Jethro, along with Moses' wife and son, came to him in the wilderness where he was camped, sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, are coming to you with your wife and your two sons. And Moses goes out to meet them. Jethro rejoices over everything he's seeing happening here. And then the next day, verse 13, Moses sat down to judge the people. And they stood around Moses from morning to evening. Now, first of all, I don't know how often this happens, but it seems like I stress out a little bit just thinking about Moses going through this whole exercise. I can't imagine what it was actually like to live it. And I think that is probably the proper response because you see Jethro essentially have the same reaction. Verse 14, what is this thing you're doing for the people? Why are you alone sitting as judge while all the people stand around you from morning to evening? Moses replies, this is essentially the way it has to be done because somebody has to solve the dispute. Verse 17, what you're doing is not good, Moses' father-in-law said to him. You will certainly wear out both yourself and these people who are with you because the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do this alone. Now listen to me, I'll give you some advice, and God be with you. And essentially they set up a system. You choose somebody from every family. They will rule over the minor disputes that happen within the family. But if there's a major case, then that will come to you and that will lighten your load. If you do this and God so directs you, you will be able to endure, and also all the people will be able to go home satisfied. So first of all, I love the teachability of Moses. Okay? The teachability. Moses is chosen by God to rule over 1 million plus people. Jethro is a priest, That's it. That's all we know. We don't know how many people he served. We don't know how many people in Midian came to him to offer sacrifices. We don't even really understand what all was involved in him being a priest outside of what we know about the Levitical priesthood, right? Like, we don't know. He might have just been a kind of a patriarch of his own family kind of priest. But here he is, Jethro, which I think we would probably all agree is of lesser importance in the history of mankind than Moses. Everybody with me on that? Do you agree with me on that at least? Okay, so, and not chosen by God in quite the same way that Moses is. I mean, maybe you can argue he is chosen by God because he's a priest, but still, Moses doesn't let all of that go to his head and go, well, who are you to tell me how I'm supposed to do things? Right? Moses' response is, that's wise. I love and again, Moses is called the meekest man who ever lived, right? He's humble. He's a humble man, and you see that here in chapter 18. He is humble enough to take direction and learn from the wisdom of his father-in-law. And I love that. Secondly, what great advice. Incredible advice. This is by no means a comparison of what Moses was doing. But I kind of applied this advice this year in running camp. I had an set of assistant directors over junior side, assistant set over senior side. They were empowered to essentially make any decision they need to make. And I let them know in very blunt terms, if they came to me and said, this person needs to go home, that person would go home. They needed to have the authority to make decisions and to know that their authority would be respected and their decision would be respected. And there is a lot of peace that came with that. Do you know how many issues I had to handle at camp this year? 3. How many issues did they have to handle? Probably 3 a day. Okay? There were very few issues that they needed to pass along to me. They handled the minor stuff. I handled the big stuff. Right? And it worked beautifully. Which should have been the expectation, because it's the very same advice that Jethro is giving to Moses here. And it seems to be, in some way, again, we don't know if this is just Jethro's wisdom based on experience of years, or if this is something that he knows because of his interaction with God as a priest or whatever. But it is incredible advice, and it is wonderful. I can't tell you how many times I've seen, I'll use this as an example. There was a group of elders that I worked with one time that the elders would get upset when one particular elder would go out of town and they had a meeting, because they didn't have the rule that the elders here work toward, which is all the elders need to be in agreement. Their rule was majority rule. Unless that elder came back in town and said, hey, nope, I don't like that decision, we're going to start over. Okay? That elder essentially was a head elder, which is not the way it's supposed to work in the first place. But secondly, it was one of those things of he didn't trust them to make any decisions. They didn't trust their deacons to make any decision. Their deacons were completely powerless to make any decision whatsoever. And because of that, you know what that created? No deacon ever made any decision, because they knew they weren't allowed to. So even a minor thing of, hey, do you mind if, it might be a helpful thing, like, hey, do you mind if we created a list of young people who are going to go and clean up after the communion preparation and clean up the communion every single week? I would love that help, but let me run it by the elders. But they couldn't make any decision whatsoever. And so everything had to run through the head elder. Everything. And that's just not wise. It creates problems, it creates disputes, it creates a lack of trust among people and among leadership. It just creates all sorts of problems whenever somebody is a micromanager. This passage is anti-micromanagement. That's really what it is. And there is a wisdom and a peace that goes along with that. Moses, verse 24, listened to his father-in-law, did everything he had said. Moses chose able men from all Israel and made them leaders over the people as commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And they judged the people at all times. They would bring the hard cases to Moses, but they would judge every minor case themselves. Moses let his father-in-law go, and he journeyed to his own land. Okay, so again, it's funny to see just how successful that was. You know, it was a management system, and it made all the difference in the world. I don't know that Moses would have survived, like Jethro said, if he had not followed this advice. And there's a lot of wisdom there of leadership trusting able people to make decisions. And that's just a good thing. So, any thoughts, questions on these chapters before we wrap up today? Yep, Keith.
This advice that Jethro gives is got two for cover. One is the criteria that able, good, God-fearing, and trustworthy will keep dishonest profit. Like that last one is very key. If you think, if you're God-fearing, you could also take dishonest profit, trustworthy, dishonest profit. But for somebody who is judging over hating dishonesty, hating shady dealings is very important.
Yep.
So I thought that was good. The other thing is also the kind of the tier system that not just, oh, everybody is over 100 people. Some people over 5.
Mm-hmm.
Some are over 10, some are over 50, some are over 100, some are over 1,000.
Yep.
And that to me speaks to one, the understanding that people need to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Having that kind of power. And so if somebody is 75, maybe it gives it over 10.
Yep.
And also the fact that some people might never go past, judging by people.
Yep.
Different people have different talents and abilities. So the more I look into this, I'm doing management things now. Like there's a lot of advice that just really rings true.
Well, and I would imagine the difference in numbers there has to do with the tier system, not, okay, well, you're over 10 people and you're over 1,000 people. It's that these people over 1,000 people, and then there's somebody over 100 of those leaders, and then there's somebody over 10 of those leaders, and then somebody, and so it kind of, it's manager over manager over manager is the idea that's presented there. That's my assumption. I don't know that that's true because it doesn't lay that out specifically. Secondly, the first comment, that same broken eldership situation that I was talking about also received a weekly report of who were the top 10 givers in the congregation. So dishonest, that's not dishonest gain as much as it is preferential treatment based on gain. And there, again, that kind of brokenness, it kind of all goes together. And that's my point. When you've got broken leadership prioritizes the wrong things. And you realize that whenever you experience those kinds of things. So we'll pick up in chapter 19 for Wednesday. Still on schedule. Woohoo!